The transatlantic slave trade is one of the most tragic chapters in human history, marking a period characterized by exploitation, suffering, and profound societal changes. Among the various slave routes and movements, the Spanish slaves brought from Spain who ended up in South America and the Caribbean represent a specific aspect of this broader narrative. This slave movement is part of a complex web of events often referred to as the Atlantic slave trade. Initially, slavery in the Spanish colonies did not begin with the African slave trade. Early Spanish colonizers established the encomienda system, where indigenous people were forced into labor. However, as the indigenous population declined due to disease and brutal treatment, the need for labor in the burgeoning colonies grew. The Spanish turned to various sources to meet this demand, including the importation of enslaved Africans, as well as the transportation of slaves from Spain itself. The movement of Spanish slaves to the colonies primarily involved the forced labor of convict populations. Spain's legal system during the medieval era and beyond allowed for the punishment of minor crimes through servitude. Many prisoners were transported from Spain to the colonies as a form of penal labor. These individuals were subject to harsh working conditions, much like their African counterparts, although their status differed legally and socially. They were often referred to as tristes, a term denoting their status as unfree. In South America and the Caribbean, these Spanish slaves encountered a landscape that demanded immense resources for sugar plantations, mining, and agriculture. The Caribbean islands became central to this exploitation, with sugar as the primary crop driving economic interests. The Spanish slaves brought from Spain were forced to contribute to these economic activities in various capacities. Often, they faced brutal treatment, long hours of work, and inadequate living conditions. The movement of slaves in this context can be seen as part of a larger trend in the Atlantic world, where the exchange of goods, cultural practices, and human lives defined economies and societies. The transatlantic slave trade not only brought Africans to the New World but also established a framework of servitude and labor exploitation that would impact generations. As the demands for labor increased, the Spanish colonies began to rely heavily on African slaves, creating a demographic shift, but the experience of the Spanish slaves served to highlight the multifaceted nature of slavery during this era. The identities of these individuals were often erased in historical narratives shaped by colonial interests, and their experiences were woven into the larger tapestry of oppression that characterized the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of African slaves to the Caribbean and South America during the 16th to 19th centuries. These slaves were forcibly taken from their homelands and subjected to inhumane treatment, enduring harsh conditions on plantations and facing unimaginable hardships. The legacy of slavery continues to impact the descendants of these African slaves in the Caribbean and South America, shaping their identities and experiences to this day. While there are similarities between the experiences of African slaves in the Caribbean and South America and Black people in America, it is important to recognize that they are not the same. The history of slavery in each region differed in terms of the scale, duration, and specific circumstances of enslavement. Additionally, the cultural, social, and political contexts in which slavery occurred varied across the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. Furthermore, the experiences of African slaves in the Caribbean and South America have been shaped by the unique colonial histories of each region. In the Caribbean, for example, the legacy of plantation slavery continues to influence social structures and economic inequality. In South America, the legacy of slavery is intertwined with complex issues of race, identity, and national identity. It is also important to consider the diverse experiences of Black people in America, who have faced centuries of systemic racism, discrimination, and violence. The history of slavery in America has had a profound impact on the social, economic, and political realities of Black Americans, shaping their identities and struggles for justice and equality. The experiences of African slaves in the Caribbean and South America, as well as Black people in America, have been marked by a history of oppression, exploitation, and discrimination. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly brought millions of Africans to the New World, where they were subjected to brutal conditions and treated as property rather than human beings. In the Caribbean and South America, African slaves were forced to work on plantations cultivating crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton. They endured long hours of labor under harsh conditions, with little to no rest or adequate food and shelter. Many slaves suffered physical abuse and punishment at the hands of their owners, further dehumanizing their existence. In America, black people faced similar hardships, as they were subjected to slavery, segregation, and systemic racism. Even after slavery was abolished, African Americans continued to face discrimination in areas such as education, employment, housing, and access to basic rights and services. Despite these adversities, African slaves and black people in America have shown resilience, strength, and perseverance in the face of injustice. They have fought for their rights and dignity through movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, which sought to end segregation and secure equal rights for all citizens. The experiences of African slaves in the Caribbean and South America, as well as black people in America, highlight the enduring legacy of slavery and racism that continues to impact individuals and communities to this day. It is important to acknowledge and learn from this history in order to work towards a more just and inclusive society for all. The movement of Spanish slaves from Spain to South America and the Caribbean was a tragic element of the broader Atlantic slave trade. These individuals, often convicts, found themselves caught in the relentless machinery of colonial exploitation under horrid conditions. While the African slave trade would come to dominate the narrative surrounding slavery in the Americas, the story of Spanish slaves illuminates the diverse and complex experiences of all those subjected to forced labor systems during this dark period in history. In conclusion, while there are similarities between the experiences of African slaves in the Caribbean and South America and black people in America, it is important to recognize the distinct historical, cultural, and social contexts in which slavery occurred in each region. Acknowledging these differences is essential for understanding the complexities of the African diaspora and working towards a more just and equitable society for all. 10 Down WJ, where creativity meets impact.